Number 10. Baby Inheritors. We've gone into the Spider-Verse multiple times in the comics now, and we are about to go back again. Supposedly one last time. We'll see what happens. But I'm sure nothing can top the weirdness of how the last Spider-Man multiversal crossover ended. In the first Spider-Verse in the comics, the Inheritors were the group of villains that the Spider Totems of the multiverse had to band together to fight. At the end of that event, they defeated them, but then oddly enough, they returned again via Superior Spider-Man, aka Otto Octavius' tech. The Inheritors managed to clone themselves and make a comeback in Spider-Geddon, once more uniting the Spider Army to come together and defeat their threat to the multiverse. The Inheritors are basically energy vampires who specifically prey on animal or insect-inspired totemic beings, like Spider Totems. Spider Totems are basically people across the multiverse with spider-like powers and abilities who were destined to become spider-themed heroes and protect their world. At the end of Spider-Geddon, the Inheritors are defeated by being turned into baby versions of themselves and given to Spider-Man, Aunt May of Earth 3123, to raise to be good. Because that's how you defeat villains sometimes. Sometimes you just gotta raise them yourself. Number 9. Feed me plasma. One of the weirdest things, especially here on the internet, is everyone's obsession with Morbius feeding on plasma and not human blood. I mean, the amount of times I've talked about Morbius drinking blood and people on the internet have been like, actually it's plasma. It's an insane amount. People really love the plasma. This doesn't actually come from the comics though, but instead is something that grew out of the Spider-Man animated series. And it came to be thanks to censorship, of course, like with so many weird things that we have, because isn't that just always the way? Morbius, being a vampire on basically a children's animated series, wasn't allowed to be shown feeding on blood because it was considered too violent. So instead they had Morbius thirst for plasma. That way you can get around the whole blood thing, although plasma of course it's in blood. Plasma is the liquid portion of your blood that contains mainly water as opposed to the other portions of your blood, which is primarily made up of red and white blood cells as well as platelets. And friends, before we move on to this next spot, if you are loving this list here and you are loving what we do on the channel, please head on over to Facebook. You can follow us there and we have more exciting content coming your way and some exclusive things planned for you in the future, we hope.
At number 8, we have Phone Ranger. Okay, it's getting hard to keep up this charade that I actually want these characters woven into the MCU in any major way. I think it's fair to say that any of these heroes so far would be funny to see briefly just for the meme of it, but I don't want to pretend I'd actually want a Phone Ranger series or even a scene with him any longer than 2 minutes. Because this hero is literally a phone repairman with a mini spaceship. After an average phone repairman named A.G. Bell discovers a tiny ship trapped in one of the phones he's repairing, he gains access to every communication system in the world. This isn't the most compelling power set or origin story, but I don't know, maybe we could even just see an homage to this weird superhero when Ant-Man flies a tiny ship out of a telephone speaker or something, I don't know. At number 7, we have Grasshopper. This guy is known as a bit of a loser in the comics, having been killed off a handful of times in pretty embarrassing ways. But despite this, and despite the fact that he's based on a much less cool insect than Spider-Man, I think he has some potential. Even if he's kept as a sort of B character, I think he could fit into the MCU in some weird way. I think his costume isn't badly designed, and well, that's kind of it. I think he could do for a modernization upgrade, but maybe one of the Marvel heroes' out of touch parents could take on the mantle for a bit, or an annoying older brother or something like that. He only joins the Great Lakes Avengers in the comics, so maybe in the future an MCU version of the Young Avengers could come across the GLA and we can catch a glimpse of Grasshopper. At number 6, we have Glob Herman. With hints at mutants appearing in Phase 5 of the MCU, we may be able to see some X-Men in the MCU pretty soon. Now, I don't think they'll be rushing to get Glob Herman on the big screen before Wolverine or Magneto, let's say, but there's a chance that if they really dive into the X-Men storylines and characters, we can expect to see a whole slew of new characters, and maybe Glob Herman will make a cameo. Glob has a thick layer of wax instead of skin, which is transparent and allows you to see his skeleton and organs moving around in there. But he isn't entirely useless and is actually known to be relatively important as a character in the comics. He can light himself on fire and fling hot flaming wax at his enemies, which isn't an awful power set, but it's also pretty bad. At number 5 is Doorman. Okay, this is another one like Grasshopper that I genuinely think could have a chance at making an appearance in the MCU. Aside from his god-awful name and reputation as a pretty ridiculous hero, I think his power set and aesthetic are pretty dang cool. And no, he isn't super good at holding the door for people, he's actually got the ability to create portals as well as making himself totally intangible. And that pairing of powers actually matches up to being a pretty powerful combination. And tied in with his cool black and white color scheme, I honestly think that this guy can make an appearance in the MCU outside of a meme-like context. In the comics, he sacrifices himself to take down Maelstrom, but is revived as the Angel of Death, at which point he gets a major power boost. So perhaps this iteration as the Angel of Death could make an appearance, hinting at the backstory of having been Doorman in a previous life. At number 4 is Squirrel Girl. Probably the most competent member of the Great Lakes Avengers, Squirrel Girl actually has a decent chance to appear in some iteration in a future MCU project. At first glance, she seems like a pretty silly character sporting a big furry squirrel tail and ears, but she actually has a pretty decent power set on top of it, including super strength, night vision, a healing factor, and superhuman leaping. She's also adept with computers and communications, so even if we don't see her on the battlefield, it's possible she appears in the control room of some SHIELD operation at some point. I don't know, Squirrel Girl is a cult favorite, and out of all the weird characters on this list, she's probably one of the most respected out of all of them.
Number 3, Vision loves Scarlet Witch because of Ultron? This is a weird theory that some people have in relation to Wanda and Ultron in the Marvel Cinematic Universe. The belief here is that Vision, who was made by Ultron, loves Wanda, not necessarily because of his own feelings developing for her, although this does make a lot of sense just because, you know, his character development and that is what happens in the story, but because Ultron himself perhaps had feelings for Wanda. And as crazy as this theory sounds, and perhaps non-foundational as it sounds in relation to what goes on in those movies, the reality is it could be true, and here is why. In the Ultimate Universe, which serves to inspire much that we see in the MCU, Ultron is in love with Wanda, and it isn't any hidden love either. It's laid out in plain sight. Even weirder, obviously, is that Wanda isn't interested, as she is with her brother at the time, and Wanda's spurning of Ultron is what also apparently helps to turn him into a killer robot. Yeah, it's very different. Very fresh. Number 2, Ruins. The multiverse is full of disturbing realities, but none so disturbing, I don't think, as Ruins. Marvel's Ruins was created by Warren Ellis, with beautifully haunting artwork by Therese and Cliff Nielsen and Chris Moeller. The story that allows us to see into this world is only 2 issues in length, and yet based on the content in here, it does feel much longer. This is because Marvel Ruins is a parody of the Marvel Universe, where Ellis imagines what the heroes and villains would be like in the real world. It's bleak and disturbing, with many superpowers being practically explored in a way that turns them into more of a curse than a blessing. Number 1, Sins Past. Maybe one of the weirdest things in all of the cosmos and across multiple realities actually comes from the main reality of Earth 616. This awful thing has since been retconned away, but it still happened, and you can still go back and read it, and likely be traumatized by reading it upon doing so. That's right, we are talking about Sins Past. In this story, Gwen Stacy and Norman Osborn were given added history. Doesn't sound so bad, yeah? Until you learn that this added history involved them being in a relationship together, a secret relationship where Norman got Gwen pregnant and was her first intimate lover. And as a result of their affair, they had 2 twin children who grew up to become goblins themselves. That's all I got. That's it, man. I'm just gonna throw my hands up to that because that's insane. Initially, of their children, Gabriel was known as Grey Goblin, and later on both Sarah and Gabriel will disguise themselves as the villain known as Kindred, which happened more recently in the comics. Don't worry though, we'd later learn that these 2 were actually just unstable clones, as opposed to being the true naturally born children of Gwen and Norman and their love affair, who fortunately were re-retconned as having never been romantically together. Thank goodness. Thank you, Nick Spencer. Thank you for fixing it.
At number 10, we have the Korvak Saga. This one is weird in that it's very confusing and sort of bites off more than it can chew. When Michael Korvak comes to the present day, he gains immense power from Galactus' ship and comes to Earth with basically god status. Where he comes from is the confusing part, because he claims to have fought the original Guardians of the Galaxy in the year 3000, which gets explained but seems very bizarre considering that's in the future and there is indeed a present day Guardians of the Galaxy who actually end up fighting Korvak during this conflict. The Avengers then join them in the battle, and well, they all end up getting killed by the godlike villain Michael Korvak. But in a state of grief, Korvak decides to resurrect all the heroes and then kill himself, which is really unexpected and pretty weird. It's a bit of a mind trip, but ultimately ties up as a pretty epic storyline that actually stands the test of time in many ways. At number 9 is the Serpent Crown. This storyline is something that has kind of gone down as an iconic story, but at the time might have been seen as a big risk by writers and readers alike. Partly because it marks the first and last time a cowboy named the Two Gun Kid was part of the Avengers, and partly because it pits the Avengers against the Squadron Sinister, which is basically Marvel's knockoff Justice League. While Kang the Conqueror is searching for the Serpent Crown, he sends the Avengers into an alternate dimension where they have to fight the likes of Hyperion, Nighthawk, Power Princess, Speed Demon, and Dr. Spectrum. Although these characters had already made an appearance by this time, this is one of their bigger features, and anyone would agree that a Justice League knockoff in the world of Marvel seems like a bad idea on paper. But quite to the contrary, a few of the members of Squadron Sinister end up sticking around, like Nighthawk and Hyperion, the latter of which later becomes a member of the Avengers himself.
Number 8. Fin Fang Foom's Diaper. Speaking of censorship, I have another strange one for you. This one comes from the comics, and we have the Comics Code Authority to thank for it, of course. Thanks, CCA. Thank you so much. Fin Fang Foom is a dragon that is well known in the comics. Recently in the MCU, we actually thought Fin Fang Foom might appear in Shang-Chi based on merch, only to learn that the dragon there was actually instead known as the Great Protector, so that was not Fin Fang Foom. In the comics, I recently saw Fin Fang Foom in the pages of Marauders, where he pops up before the original team dissolved, with Iceman actually fighting Foom before deciding to take a vacation from his work on the team, eventually leaving the Marauders completely once they rebooted that series. Well, I mean, at least he's gone for now. Bobby might be back later, but for now, he's out. Fin Fang Foom has years of history, and a good chunk of those years he spent in a purple diaper. Why? Because the CCA was worried about the dragon's indecent exposure. I'm not joking here, guys. That's what they were like. They're like, he's gotta wear pants. He's out there, he's naked. And it is for the reason of dragon modesty that he was forced to wear his iconic purple diaper or boxers or shorts, depending on, of course, who's drawing him and, you know, how you, as the person reading and looking at the comic, want to interpret that garment that he was forced into wearing. Number 7. Hand suckers on the hands. If you thought the plasma thing was weird, it only really gets weirder when it comes to Morbius in the Spider-Man animated series. In the animated series, Morbius not only needed plasma instead of just straight up blood to live, but he also had fangs that basically went unused. I know what you're thinking, but wait a minute, Amanda, hold up! Don't vampires feed on their victims using their fangs? Yes, in folklore, they're either actually using their fangs to rend the flesh of their victims so they can basically feast on their blood, or in some cases, they actually even feed through their fangs using their especially long and pointed incisors like we would a straw. And in some cases, fangs have sort of like venom in them that sort of subdues their victim, depending on, you know, which type of vampire we're talking about from lore. However, in the animated series, while Morbius does have fangs, he doesn't really use them to feast. In that respect, they are more there for visual clarity and effect. Instead, Morbius has tentacle-like suckers on his hands, which is how he feeds. Weird? You betcha. Number 6. Clone Saga. Some people love it, some people hate it, but if you had to collect it or organize it into a trade, all of us were likely confused by it. Even to this day, the Clone Saga remains a hard story to follow because it spanned so many different Spider-Man comics, and because we had so many Spider-Man comics. The Clone Saga is a story where Spider-Man ends up being cloned by his nemesis, the Jackal, and then upon meeting his clones begins to question if he is actually the original Peter Parker or merely a clone himself. A lot of people are not fans of the Clone Saga because of the story's twist at the end, which many felt made the emotional investment that they had put in during the crossover story feel worthless in the end. Number 5. Mutants No More. What would a weirdest things list for Marvel be without me mentioning my extreme dislike of Brotherhood of Evil Mutants originating members Scarlet Witch and Quicksilver being retconned as non-mutants. This all went down in Axis, where it was revealed via a retcon that Scarlet Scarlet Witch and Quicksilver had never truly been mutants or Magneto's children, but were basically tricked into thinking so based on the High Evolutionary experimenting on them when they were young. Once the High Evolutionary was done with them, he discarded them, disguising them genetically as mutants. Wanda found out about this when she attempted to put a blood curse on her relatives, only to discover that it worked on Pietro, but not on Eric. So yes, Eric is not the father, but he still basically was with them the whole time and then was like, by the way, I'm your dad, and now he's not. I think we can still count it, even though they're not blood related, but they should be blood related. It hurts my brain. Number 4, Ultimate Scarlet Witch and Quicksilver. One of the weirdest things that we've seen to this day comes from the recesses of the Marvel Multiverse. Because of course it does. The Ultimate Universe is the universe of Earth 1610, which was created to be its own world and separate line from the main continuity, focused on making Marvel Comics more accessible to new fans while offering established fans a fresh take on their favorite characters, many of which were either more grounded or gritty or some combination of those two. In the case of Scarlet Witch and Quicksilver, I definitely say we got something unique, but not in a good way. While Wanda and her brother Pietro have always been close in the 616 continuity, 1610 took this to another level, with the two siblings having an implied romantic relationship. Yeah, not necessarily what we expected or wanted from a fresh take on these characters.
At number 3 is House of X and the Powers of X. This storyline chronicles the events of X-Men creating their own nation state on an island called Krakoa. This utopian society is meant to be only inhabited by mutants and is led by Professor X, Magneto, and Apocalypse. Not only does this island allow mutants to live beyond the controlling grips of humanity, but it also allows them to come back to life upon death, thanks to a group of mutants known as the Five. After a long drawn-out conflict with the humans, Krakoa becomes more of a haven for mutants than anyone could have hoped for, unless you're the governments of the world, because of course, conflict still follows the mutants to the island in the form of a looming war between man-made Sentinels and the X-Men. And though readers may have been thinking an island inhabited by mutants might have had its issues plot-wise, it's actually become one of the most iconic X-Men stories in all of Marvel, and is discussed online as being one of the more feasible ways for Marvel to integrate the X-Men into the MCU, whether they go with it or not. At number 2, we have Superior Spider-Man. This storyline really is a long shot. For those who aren't aware, Superior Spider-Man is the version of Spider-Man that's taken on by Dr. Otto Octavius, aka Dr. Octopus, at least at first. In a massive twist of fate, Doc Ock actually takes over for Peter Parker after his death, and the result is a more advanced version of the hero with retractable arms and a plethora of new gadgets. What's even weirder though is that Doc Ock's mind has been transferred to Peter Parker's body, meaning that he doesn't actually appear as himself when out of the costume. This first takes place in Amazing Spider-Man number 697 and eventually veers into another comic series called Avenging Spider-Man, where Otto continues his run as the web slinger. It's a pretty insane idea to try something like this, but it's actually yielded a really cool version of Spider-Man and even shows us another side to Doc Ock that we surely wouldn't have been introduced to otherwise. Finally, at number 1, we have Watchmen. This now insanely popular comic book series wasn't meant to be a massive success. It started as a 12-part maxi series in 1986, set in an alternate true reality where Nixon is president and New York City is the setting instead of a Gotham or a Metropolis. Except the one catch is that in our world, superheroes are real, with only one of them, Dr. Manhattan, actually having real superpowers. It's a real look at what the world would be like if certain people decided to take on the violent lifestyle of being a vigilante in modern day America. And the result is clearly something that people were interested in. But of course, like anything, it wasn't expected to be quite as big of a hit as it was. The characters were originally going to be pulled from old comics by the discontinued Charlton Comics, giving new life to a group of obscure heroes, but due to copyright issues and other bureaucratic complications, writer Alan Moore and illustrator Dave Gibbons were forced to develop their own characters from scratch, which could have led to the series being a total failure since this adds a lot of extra work and new names might have curbed the interest of diehard DC fans. But it's good that they did it, because in the end, we got Watchmen. At number 10, we have Hindsight Lad. Okay, there are going to be some joke characters on here, but I'm not messing around when I say that some of these extra weird ones would actually do well in the MCU, at least for a moment. For example, Hindsight Lad. Although he's very silly and probably not meant to be more than a gag character in the comics, I think would be a very funny throwaway joke for the bigger Marvel fans. In the comics, Hindsight Lad is actually just computer programmer Carlton Lafroige, who tries to pass off the ability of learning from the past as a superpower to make it onto the new Warriors team. What's even dumber than the name is that he actually makes it onto the team and quickly becomes the least liked member. But I don't see the MCU taking the joke that far, but I could see a non-superpowered supporting character taking on the goofy mantle for a one-off joke. At number 9 we have Dupe. As silly as this character seems, he's not much more bizarre than Rocket Raccoon, and that character has proven to have made a seamless transition into the MCU since his debut in 2014. Okay, Dupe is a little sillier. He's an alien creature who looks like a green bean with arms and a face, but he has a huge range of powers and an actually pretty impressive strength level, giving him enough to hold up in a battle with Thor. He can shoot psionic energy and also use, get this, bass guitar to channel the power of the funk. He also uses a gun called the Ultimate Nullifier, which shoots bees, chainsaws, and bowling balls out of it. He's probably the weirdest character on this list in all respects, but maybe he would be a fun cameo in a battle set in space in an upcoming movie, or maybe just somewhere in the background for a second. Once again, I really think this character should only exist as a fun moment and not by any means be featured in any front-running role. I don't want to watch the MCU destroy their legacy any more than the next guy. At number 8 is Shadowland. This storyline is one that has been criticized mainly due to the notion that it shows Daredevil doing some pretty bad stuff, which is unlike him. In this storyline, Daredevil basically goes on a power trip and decides that to take down the underground crime ring, The Hand, he has to actually join them. And not only join them, lead them. But after he's possessed by a demonic beast that The Hand worships, he becomes more evil than anticipated, opening a massive prison and tossing basically everyone in it. Basically, the story of Shadowland shows how other heroes are forced to confront Daredevil in his newfound villainy and attempt to bring him back to his senses. The Avengers take on this task and send in the likes of Luke Cage, Moon Knight, Ghost Rider, SpiderMan, and Elektra, among others, to try and put a stop to his madness. And although it does seem like a bit of an oddly motivated plot, it has become somewhat iconic just because of the sheer mayhem that ensues when all of these notable forces clash. At number 7 is New Avengers Illuminati. This is originally known as a one-off storyline, but it's become known as the origin to how the now popular Illuminati were formed in the context of Marvel. And it's still a surprise to most readers that it ended up actually working, mainly because it features so many heavy hitters that it's hard to imagine how they'd all cooperate with one another. Originally formed to feature all the smartest minds in Marvel, the Illuminati also seemed like a weird move to add yet another superhero team to Marvel's roster, with Iron Man, Mr. Fantastic, Professor X, Black Panther, Black Bolt, Doctor Strange, Namor, and Yellow Jacket. It's hard to imagine that this group actually gelled and didn't get written off as too overpowered. But it's actually become one of the cult favorite superhero groups in all of Marvel and DC Comics, which is fun to see because otherwise these characters don't really have much business appearing in the same storyline, let alone the same room as one another. At number 6 we have Superman Red Sun. This storyline is a weird one in that it tells the story of Superman being a Soviet hero, with his ship having crash landed in Soviet Ukraine rather than Kansas, with Lex Luthor being the president of the United States and Superman's childhood love being replaced by a Soviet party member named Lana Lazarenko. It initially appears to just be a story of what-ifs set in the Cold War era. Superman finds himself at the helm of the US-Russia conflict with President Luthor, which escalates in a similar fashion to the actual events of the Cold War. On top of all this, we also see an anti-revolutionary Batman trying to avenge his parents' death at the hand of the secret police, which all just seems super bizarre and convoluted at first. But what ends up making this storyline stand out as one of the more iconic and celebrated DC storylines is how it offers commentary to real international conflicts in the modern world. Published in 2005, it doesn't quite speak to these issues as they are today, but it does remind us how complicated and long-winded the tensions between the East and the West have been. At number 5 is Batman: The Return of Bruce Wayne. This storyline is a really fun one and is only weird because of how unusual the adventure is for Bruce Wayne. The story starts after the events of Final Crisis when Batman is zapped by Darkseid's Omega beams and sent back to the Paleolithic era, aka the Stone Age. He then has to fight his way through every different epoch of human history until he gets to the present, influencing the world around him as he goes. For example, he inadvertently starts a bat-worshipping cult in the Stone Age, which he then finds artifacts of during his time fighting Blackbeard in the 18th century. The Grant Morrison story really adds a lot to the mythology of Batman as well, and much of it has become canon, like Batman's 17th century ancestor Nathaniel Wayne. The story itself could be considered pretty strange, seeing as it begins in a caveman setting, but the depth of the adventure and the place it ends up really makes this weird story actually work really well. At number 4 we have Vision Volume 2. Released in 2015, this storyline explores the story of Vision trying to find purpose in life through the pursuit of a nuclear family. With a wife and 2 kids, they become the android family on the block and for the most part deal with pretty mundane human problems. At least at first. When this first came out, it may have struck readers as being a little too strange to actually work, but there is more depth to this 12-part maxi series than was first expected of it. In choosing to create his own family, Vision seems to be adjusting the protocol instilled in him by his creator Ultron. Instead of pursuing something of a set purpose, like Ultron's proposition of cleansing the Earth of humanity, Vision wants to set off on a pursuit of the unobtainable, which he deems to be the essence of freedom. And in the case of this series, that unattainable goal seems to be the American dream. This series ended up being so influential that it's one of the main inspirations for the hit Disney Plus series WandaVision. At number 3 we have Howard the Duck. We all know that back in 2014, Marvel gifted viewers with one of the best memes of the year with a fake post-credits sequence suggesting that there'd be a Howard movie coming out in the MCU. Of course, this was just a poke at how silly the idea would be, and I agree. I just think that now, with all the fan service that has been done over the last few years, it's possible that we get to see this little dude again at some point. All joking aside though, Howard the Duck has appeared in so many Marvel events in the comics at one point or another that his wiki is actually up there with one of the longer reads out of any hero I've read. From the Fear Itself storyline to Original Sin, Marvel Comics often takes any interdimensional event as an excuse to bring back Howard for a laugh. So why wouldn't they continue to do so in the MCU? I bet the Guardians of the Galaxy post-credits scene wasn't the last we'll see of this very serious detective. And the 1986 feature film with a 14% on Rotten Tomatoes does not count. At number 2 we have Marrow. A former member of the X-Men, Marrow is another example of a sort of weird character that we can imagine being featured in one way or another in an upcoming MCU project. Definitely not in this phase, since they haven't yet included X-Men in their rollouts as of yet, but maybe in phase 5 they'll dig deep and feature some more niche X-Men like Marrow. Her powers are basically that she can grow her bones on command. Well, at first it isn't on command really, she is actually known at first to have very little control of her powers, leaving her overtaken by the extreme growth of bone matter from within her body, which is sort of gross and terrifying, but perhaps that could be used in a cool way for the MCU. Maybe Marrow is facing challenges controlling her powers throughout one of the movies, and only when Professor X helps her hone them does she come through as a Deus Ex Machina at the end of one of the movies. I don't know, something like that. She's not even that weird honestly, I just genuinely think I'd like to see her in an MCU project. At number 1 we have the one and only, my all-time favorite, 3D Man. If you've watched my other Weird Heroes lists, you'll know by now that I'm a huge fan of 3D Man. Is that ironic? Is it a serious claim? You can't tell. Well, honestly, it's a bit of both. Primarily, I just love the idea of a hero that's 3D themed with absolutely no relationship to anything 3D whatsoever. Something about the character being stuck in the early 2000s when 3D had hit another golden age, sporting a green and red suit and the whole thing, something about that just makes me laugh. So that's the ironic side, but honestly, I think this character could be explored further. Delroy Garrett Jr. grew up as a track and field star, competing in the Olympics and the whole 9 yards, no pun intended. But I feel like there hasn't been a hero that's before anything else an athlete. Unless you count Spider-Girl. I guess Spider-Girl was an athlete in school, but she hasn't been in the MCU. But I just feel like this could be a cool opportunity for Marvel to offer more representation to the athletics community. That and how 3D Man's whole vibe is lost in time, and it would be so cool and maybe a bit refreshing to revisit that retro early 2000s era at some point on the big or small screen.